Welcome back to Foreign Correspondents. I'm Moon Young, and it is the third week of October, and I'm joined by our wonderful panel of foreign journalists this week. Welcome all to the program. Earlier this month, the chief negotiators of North Korea and the United States met in Stockholm, Sweden for their first in-depth talks since June, when President Donald Trump and Chairman Kim Jongun met briefly at the DMZ between the two Koreas. But the highly anticipated working-level talks broke off, dashing prospects for an end to months of stalemate. On this week's edition of Foreign Correspondent, we sit down with our panel of foreign correspondents to discuss what might have gone wrong during those talks, why the negotiators are struggling to regain momentum, and what might be next in this chapter of their talks. So tell me, what kind of stories did you write regarding the latest working-level denuclearization talks in Stockholm, and how it broke off, dashing all hopes?
Yeah, so I'm proud to say that we sort of had a quasi-scoop in revealing the location of the talks about a day before it started to become public. We'd understood that Sweden and Mongolia were sort of the two points of for discussion that could have been on the cards, and through intensively asking a lot of people that we thought might be involved, and we figured out it was Stockholm, and so that was the first story we did on it.
William.
Yeah, nothing earth-shattering here. I think what I was trying to do for our audience was put this in some type of historical context. I mean, the basic narrative I think a lot of people drew from this was that North Korea has a reputation for walking away from these talks. But it's interesting to me, as you look at the past couple of years of diplomacy, that Donald Trump has that reputation just as much. I mean, he essentially walked away in Hanoi, and even before the first summit in Singapore, he called off that meeting. So, I mean, this is obviously something that both sides want to do. They want to be the ones that walk away. So just sort of putting it in a historical context, and what does that mean? That's what I focused on this week.
Now, North Korea pinned the blame squarely on the U.S. for the collapse in their working-level talks.
우리가 이미 미국 측에 어떤 계산법이 필요한가를 명백히 설명하고 시간도 충분히 주었음에도 불구하고 미국이 빈손으로 협상에 나온 것은 결국 문제를 풀 생각이 없다는 것을 보여줍니다.
However, the U.S. refuted North Korea's claim, saying that Washington had brought many creative ideas to the table. Of course, details of what exactly happened during the talks in Stockholm remain unclear, but the North Korean negotiator expressed his displeasure, stating that Washington came to the talks empty-handed.
완전히 빈손으로 나왔습니다.
What do you think actually happened there?
So if you rewind to Singapore and Hanoi, you'll recall that was a time when the US was publicly saying it was going to get full denuclearization on a very short timeline. I think the shift is that the US, its interpretation of a new method is that it's now open to much more incremental, slow-motion talks. But the sort of divergence in opinion with the North Koreans is that the US wants to do this through a slow drip sort of mechanism where there are no concessions provided up front. And I think that was one of the big problems. But in terms of the logistics, on the Friday, from what I understand, is there was a protocol meeting, and the US, I understand from sources, was a bit apprehensive that the North may just come with an ultimatum, as it has done in the past. Mm-hmm. And so that protocol meeting was intended as a kind of litmus test to see if it's actually appropriate for Steve Biegun, the US Special Envoy, to meet with Kim Jongun, the North Korean negotiator, the next day. And it passed that first test. But on the second day, even though we had these very nice photos of them standing outside the conference facility, posing for the cameras, looking quite civil, and even though the meeting went longer than expected, I think by about 3 or 4 hours, it ended in a very acrimonious North Korean description of the talks.
Now, many experts have been analyzing the possible reasons behind the collapse of the Stockholm working level talks. Some say that North Korea may once again be resorting to the strategy of brinkmanship.
앞으로 회담이 진행되는가 마는가 하는 것은 미국 측에 달려 있고 또 미국이 준비가 제대로 되지 않으면은 그 어떤 끔찍한 사변이 차려질 수 있겠는지 누가 알겠습니까? 두고 봅시다.
다시 회담 장소에 나오실 의욕이 있으십니까?
미국 중에 물어보십시오. 우리로서는 이번 회담에 대해서 매우 욕스럽게 생각을 합니다.
Now, do you believe that North Korea could revert its strategy of brinkmanship after this latest setback? Could it have its desired effects on the North Korean side, I guess?
Yeah, I mean, they've already said that the future of no more ICBM and nuclear testing is contingent on the US posture.
우리의 핵시험과 ICBM 시험 발사 중지가 계속 유지되는가, 그렇지 않으면은 되살리는가 하는 것은 전적으로 미국의 입장에 달려 있습니다.
So they're sort of slightly ambiguously issuing threats in that regard. The thing is, like in our analysis, we have started to believe that North Korea may actually not need a deal with the US as much as people think because of the huge progress in China-North Korea relations at the moment. Huge economic trade increasing, new bridges opening, and so on. But the thing is, if they go ahead with ICBM testing and nuclear testing next year, it will be a very, very risky strategy because you would predict that China would be at the P5 at the UN, supporting new sanctions to respond to those kind of destabilizing steps. That being said, if the trade war does continue and gets worse between the US and PRC, maybe they would have North Korea's back, and maybe they would say, well, sanctions are now maxed out. There's not really anything more we can add, and therefore we do not believe that it's worth increasing the pressure. But it's really hard to know.
Yeah, it's difficult to make. I agree. It's difficult to make any prediction, but I do think that anyway we will see more. I don't like to use the word provocation, but we will see at least more tests. Missile launch from submarine. Because anyway, North Korea is continuing to build its weapon program. So to continue to build your program, you need to do tests. And maybe about a nuclear test, it's difficult to say. I don't know what will be the position of China. And for me, I don't think they will use a trade war with the US I don't think they will accept, even though there is a trade war with the US, I don't see them accepting so easily another nuclear test.
Right, nuclear test is probably a no-no for China, right?
You never know, but that's how I see it. And the sanction, of course, now the sanction are more relaxed because China is turning a blind eye on many things happening at the border. But that cannot last. Maybe they can reverse that position.
The question is, what do they do at the end of the year, though, with this deadline? If they've set this end-of-year deadline, which North Korean officials and state media keep bringing up again and again, what do they need in order to, I guess, maintain credibility in that way? I definitely agree with what you have both said regarding if they're going to take the approach of abandoning talks, then China and Russia become even more important and they'll be less likely to make them mad. But at the same time, they're going to have to do something, you would think, in order to maintain this deadline credibility.
Maybe they can do something that doesn't cross the red line. I don't know. Range missile, submarine.
So many options.
I mean, like this timeline, this self-imposed timeline that North Korea set of the end of the year, to me feels like it's a double-edged sword for North Korea as well. Because what are they really going to do?
I mean, it's a classic sales strategy, right? You put a false deadline on, and you might not actually have any leverage to back it up. They're dealing with a master salesman, Donald Trump. But they also know that his next year is an election year, and so that by really sharpening that strategic choice to the US, either they have to capitulate in order to ensure there's peace on the peninsula next year and Trump can have a modest foreign policy victory, or Trump risks real instability and embarrassment with the North Koreans launching multiple missiles on US holidays and important debate evenings and things like that. it's a tough one for Trump, actually.
On the eve of their working level discussions, North Korea caught the U.S. off guard by test launching a submarine-launched ballistic missile.
What we know is that the missile was fired from a sea-based platform in the Wonsan Bay.
Many U.S. media outlets interpreted North Korea's missile launch as a means to gain leverage over Washington in their working level talks. Why do you think North Korea test launched SLBM just days before the working level talks?
I think it was likely what many people said in order to increase leverage. I think maybe they wanted to sneak one last test in before these talks started, and they bet that the U.S. would not respond in a very harsh way and cut off talks. It seems they were right.
I agree. I mean, the more advanced your program is, the more concessions you can get. Some people say that as well it was an answer to South Korea showing, the day before, a couple of days before, they knew F-35 stealth
day before, Armed
military
Forces
planes.
Day.
There's many possible explanations, but I do think it's linked to the negotiations.
But also, now during the testing of this SLBM, North Korean Chairman Kim Jongun was not present. Is the question.
Our colleague Colin Zverko, who's a bit of an imagery analyst, he compared footage from Chosun Jungang Television, the state broadcaster, with the Rodong Shinmun, the state newspaper, and we could clearly see in the same shot things that had been moved around and missing. There was an ashtray there was a phone there was a cup of juice, which and there was paperweights that Kim Jong-un always normally has. Very odd to edit that out. And Kim's never missed a single launch, right? So I put money that he was there.
Okay, so he was there, but North Korea clearly wanted to convey the message to the U.S., perhaps, that Kim Jong-un was not there. The intention there.
I think it's just like with the Saudi leader MBS. He was not directly involved with the murder of Saudi journalist Jamal Khashoggi, and can point to rogue elements, and likewise Kim Jong-un can say, I wasn't there, maybe this was out of my control, guys. I think it's similar kind of logic, that they just wanted to avoid having him directly associated with something so provocative.
Which means North Korea, Kim Jong-un at least, wants to keep his friendly relations with Donald Trump.
It seems pretty clear that Kim Jong-un wants to continue conversations with Donald Trump. The interesting thing I've seen a lot of analysts talk about is whether that top-level interaction is sort of hurting the bottom-level interaction, because it does seem obvious at this point that North Korea would prefer the interaction happen between Trump and Kim. Mm-hmm. Is that keeping there from being progress on a working level?
U.S. also test-fired an ICBM of its own just 10 hours after North Korea conducted its SLBM test. What intentions do you believe the U.S. had in conducting its own ICBM on the heels of North Korea's SLBM launch?
Well, I mean, they said it was not timed, and they always say these things were not timed to coincide with world events.
Yeah, they test 4 a year, I believe, Minuteman, 3 ICBMs.
And it takes a long time to plan, allegedly. So, I mean, that makes some sense. What is interesting to me is whether or not this ICBM test, given the foreign ministry statement yesterday, is going to be used as some sort of pretext for upcoming North Korean actions, such as perhaps ramping up missile tests or something.
Yeah, because I don't think this American test makes any difference for North Korea. But North Korea said that it was used. They say, oh, you made this test to try to pressure us. So I agree with you. I think they might use it as a pretext to justify any further military escalation.
The UN Security Council held an emergency meeting on October 8th in response to North Korea's latest SLBM launch.
We urge the DPRK to engage in good faith in meaningful negotiation with the United States and to take concrete steps with a view to abandoning all weapons of mass destruction and ballistic missile programs in a complete, verifiable and irreversible manner.
Now, North Korea accused the U.S. of orchestrating the UNSC meeting and called it a severe provocation.
We know well that the United States is behind the impure moves of the UK, France, and Germany. So we will sharply watch every move of the United States and UN Security Council.
Why did North Korea forge ahead with the SLBM test despite being fully aware that doing so would constitute a violation of UN sanctions on the North? I mean, they knew this would happen. They knew a UNSC meeting would happen. They knew this would be a violation of its resolutions.
But it was a good test for the North Koreans to determine whether or not the US would spearhead this or not. And from what I understood, speaking to sources familiar with the Sweden stuff, is that the US at the White House and State Department really tried their best to show restraint to that missile test. So I believe in that it was genuinely the French, Germans and Brits who spearheaded this, and it wasn't a sort of puppet play by the US. It's just those countries have those concerns and they were articulated in that way.
I mean, if anything, U.S. President Donald Trump keeps downplaying these launches by the North.
Right, and I mean, that makes total sense as a justification for the missile program. The more they do this without significant pushback, I think that it could be argued that that's weakening those sanctions. Not complain in an overt way about these launches. I mean, it has the effect, a lot of people say, of weakening UN Security Council resolutions related to North Korea's ballistic missile program. The more they do this without significant pushback, I think that it could be argued that that's weakening those sanctions
and I think
resolutions.
And that's weakening as well the US-Korea alliance, I think, because the way, I mean, this recent missile test by North Korea, they threaten South Korea. They threaten, and I think the South Korea military feels very concerned. So when you have the commander-in-chief of your main ally, we keep downplaying the threat, I think that's not that well perceived.
It makes
here.
sense from a South Korean strategic perspective to continue doing this for so many reasons.
South Korean government says the North SLBM test is not a violation of their military agreement signed last year, so between the two Koreas.
I think it's definitely a violation. I mean, it's a new weapon system that can clearly be used both to a sort of intermediate range, but those things, as they showed in the test, can be used at much shorter ranges. So Jeju could be well in range of that. I think it's just more effort by the South Korean government to try and show the North Koreans that they're willing to engage in dialogue under any circumstances whatsoever.
Right. I believe that the South Korean government and under this administration is trying its best to make peace and to basically regain momentum of dialogue momentum. Will another Trump-Kim summit bring substantial outcome if it happens?
I think if it happens, then we would be likely to see some kind of substantial outcome, because if there was a third summit resulting in similar to Hanoi, it would be really bad for the peninsula, and I think there would be sufficient checks and balances to try and prevent that. So I think, yeah, it may just be a superficial deal if there is to be a third summit, but I would predict that there would be some substantive gives on both sides if it could happen.
I feel like it's kind of pointless sometimes to predict these things, but if you look at the context, these are the first working level talks to happen without another summit being planned at the leader level. So perhaps that says something about the U.S. approach here. Maybe Donald Trump really does insist on there being some actual progress related to nuclear issues and denuclearization before another summit happens. I don't know that, but it's possible.
Now, despite the breakdown in working level talks between North Korea and the U.S., President Moon Jae-in is still keeping his hopes up and doing the best he can to facilitate constructive dialogue. However, on October 8th, the North Korea state media expressed doubts about South Korea's mediating role. Do you believe President Moon Jae-in must once again take on the role of a mediator and to encourage dialogue between Pyongyang and Washington? What can he do to facilitate further talks?
We've seen this time and time again in recent months. Chung Hwa-dae has alluded to having contact with Pyongyang, and the next day Pyongyang says, "What are you talking about? There's no contact. Stop trying to play the role of a mediator when it's not welcome." So I think it's a wise moment to stand back and just let things progress as they roll.
I mean, it's really tough now. Like Moon Jae-in is in a very, very tough position. I mean, North Korea refused to answer any of his gesture toward the regime, and South Korea now has very little leverage. I think that was you. You said that. I read that. I listened to that on the NK News podcast, saying that since South Korea keeps trying to spin things in a positive way, maybe that contributed to, before the Stockholm negotiations, that contributed to some kind of a wrong expectation from North Korea. Maybe North Korea expecting more flexibility from the US because of what South Korea at the time kept saying. And I find this idea interesting. I have no I don't really know if that contributed or not to this wrong optimism shown by North Korea before the summit. But that's true. That's maybe.
But still, last July, during a visit to Singapore, President Moon Jae-in told ASEAN member states that he was interested in encouraging North Korea's participation in their cooperative framework.
비핵화 조치를 진정성 있게 실천해 나갈 경우 아세안이 운영 중인 여러 회의체에 북한을 참여시키고 북한과의 양자 교류 협력이 강화되길 바랍니다.
Now, I know you guys have been very pessimistic about the possibility of Kim Jongun visiting Busan in November, but what would be a really good incentive to actually invite Kim Jong-un to Busan? So what kind of a card could South Korea or the U.S. or the international community play for Kim Jong-un to come to Busan?
It's pretty straightforward, I think, in a way. I mean, there's in some ways, Kim Jong-un has incentive to come to Busan, I think. Expanded cooperation with countries in Southeast Asia. He's not isolated as much diplomatically. He continues to shake hands, take pictures. And I think possibly an angle here would be that it could lead to further political polarization in South Korea. I mean, a Kim Jong-un visit to South Korea would be very controversial in many ways, and Kim Jong-un might see some benefit in that.
But I think what's more likely and is we're going to see a North Korea visit to China, Kim Jong-un visits China. In Dandong right now, there are flags since October 6th with the two North Korean and Chinese flags. And we've been wondering why they're still up. And we detected in satellite imagery analysis the other day that the brand new Yalu River Bridge, which connects Dandong to Sinuiju, it's been unfinished for 6 years, and now the North Koreans are working on connecting it. So that could, I don't know how long it will take them to connect it, but that would be a clear event to show the warming relations between the two countries that Kim Jong-un might attend. And I think that China-Russia relationship, it's so vital compared to Southeast Asian countries, including Singapore, which have a total trade ban on North Korea. Vietnam is not, we've not really seen much evolve from that summit in Hanoi. So I think it makes more sense for Kim to just double down on Beijing. And I personally think that's his plan B for next year.
Now, for our final question, we ask you, each of you, to basically summarize today's discussion into a news headline if you were to write a piece. I'm going to start with Fred.
My title, I would have write an op-ed that would be pessimistic, and the title would be North Korea, dark clouds on the horizon.
Well, I would say that there's a North Korea deadline approaching. That's the main thing for me that I'm thinking about. What does that look like? What happens?
Yeah, North Korea deadline approaching. And Chad.
Busan Odeng, an elusive incentive for Kim Jong-un.
All right. Well, we end on that pessimistic approach or note, but still, things are happening on this front, and we hope that peace efforts will continue, and we hope to see peace on the peninsula, really. But that wraps up our discussion on the breakdown of the North Korea-U.S. talks in Stockholm, what might have happened, and the forecast of Pyongyang-Washington talks from here on forth. We'll be back next week with the week's headlines to discuss with you on the current affairs for that week. That does it for me, and we'll see you right back here next week. Thanks for watching.